Welcome to another video on my channel where we are taking my aging IT support assistant and giving it an upgrade, and we're giving it a very good upgrade because what we're going to use is we're going to use the new OpenAI Assistant APIs which have just been launched. We're going to integrate that into this FlutterFlow application, and it will keep our IT support assistant firmly on topic without deviating off and giving you other recommendations that you're not interested in whatsoever. And please do follow along. The starter project is there as a link in the description, so you're going to learn an absolute ton within inside this particular video. And without further ado, let's get into it and let's get cracking. So here I am then running the application. You can see I've got my IT support assistant up and running. I'm ready to ask it a question. My PC video card is getting hot when the computer is idle. What can you suggest? Hit the send button here. So I'm hoping it will now come back with some suggestions. There we go. So it's come back with then an option. So give me another option. Let's hit the send button here. Let's see what it comes back with. There we go. So it's keeping it on topic. It's keeping it within inside the IT world. Now, let's try and fool it. Tell me how to bake a cake? Question mark. Hopefully it should refuse to answer that particular question. Excellent. So there we go. So it's staying on topic. And the reason why it's staying on topic is because I've told the OpenAI platform, the assistant platform there, to keep it within the context of IT. So let's now move on the video and let's now start to see how we implement this thing in FlutterFlow. So if you are learning FlutterFlow, please do check the link in the description because we've got the starter project. This is the project you are seeing on screen. I highly encourage you to follow along in this particular video because although the UI is pretty well much already constructed, we're going to focus on all of the key functionality to get our application up and running. So this is what it looks like. Let's just talk now about some couple of pieces of key information in order for us to orientate ourselves with this starter project. So we've got some AppState variables that's being created. Now we need to hold the API key somewhere. So this is where it needs to be. Now this is the API key from the platform, the OpenAI platform. So you need to paste that in here once you've actually generated it. And then the assistant ID is the specific assistant that we're going to create inside the OpenAI platform, and we'll come back to that very, very shortly. So that's the only two AppState variables that we've got. If I move over to the actual widget tree, let's move over to the actual page state variables here, and these ones are quite key for us. So we've got the chat history. We need to store obviously all of the conversation that's happening here, so that's where it's going to be. And then we've got the thread ID, the run ID, and the status. These are all page state variables that we're going to need to populate and to track the various values within inside this here. Because certainly these two here are going to be passed back and forth to the OpenAI platform. The status is just something we just need to keep track of when we're actually then checking for the completion of the actual chat moment within inside the actual the assistant AI platform. So pretty much they are the local state variables. We'll come back to those very, very shortly. Just some other little pieces. We've also got some data types being created. So I've got one here called content and text. You can see here that content has a data type of text, and within inside the text itself we have a value. So I'll come back to these very, very shortly, but just bear in mind that they have been created, and of course this is what we are going to add. If I go back here to the actual page state variable here, you can see that the chat history is a list of the actual content data type. Okay, so just keep that thought in your mind at the moment, and we'll come back to that a little bit later when we start actually populating those particular values. Other than that, the UI is really pretty simple here. So this is kind of like a scrolling region here that we're going to allow us to, obviously as we add various sort of conversations in here, then this will scroll down, of course, and here this is where you will type your message in to actually obviously ask the question. This is the button that's going to really kind of do most of the work. There's about 15 or 16 action blocks that we're going to create within inside there, of course, which will then actually carry out all of the work for us. Now in this particular application there's no custom code whatsoever. Everything has been implemented using the action flow editor. Now of course there is many different ways you can construct this particular application, and this is just a simple example just to kind of demonstrate the concepts, and hopefully when you take this into your own projects then you'll be able to expand your skills and it's certainly what you've learned here into your own projects in a variety of different ways. So that's it. So that's pretty well much the starter project. Let's now move over to the OpenAI platform. Let's get everything set up there, and then we'll come back to FlutterFlow very, very shortly, and we'll start working on the actual build of our application. So here I have headed over to platform.openapi.com. I've logged into my account. So of course, if you haven't got an account already, make sure you create it. This is the page that I've landed on here. There's a couple of things that you need to do here. First thing you need to do is make sure that you have some credit in the system. Now, this is just one of my accounts. I've got a number of different accounts with OpenAI, but this particular one, I've got a very, very small amount of credit on of about $5. You just go over to the settings here, go to billing, and you can see here that there I go. I've got less than $5 now actually. So you want to make sure that you add a credit card, put some balance in there. You can just put something pretty small in there, and you'll find that it will go quite a long way when actually using this particular system. Next bit, you need to make sure you've got an API key here. I've got a couple of different API keys. I'm going to use one from another account, but I just wanted to say that just make sure that you actually create a new secret. And this is what you need to make sure you make a copy of, because you're going to need to put this into the API key AppState variable with inside FlutterFlow. So make sure you do that. And then the key thing is with inside here, of course, is the documentation. Always really important to have a look at the documentation. It's updating all of the time. And it's this assistance area. This is the bit that I've kind of interpreted a little bit, and I kind of put this example together based off this documentation. But we won't worry too much about the documentation here, but certainly under the API reference, this is a section that we will look at very, very shortly, where we are looking at actually how to use some of these API calls actually into the assistance API. So we'll come back to some of this shortly, but just make sure that you're aware that's where it is positioned. What we're going to do now is we're going to move over to this section called assistance. This is the key part. Now, what you can see on screen at the moment is an IT support technician. This is what I created and I'm using with inside my application. And what you can do is you literally just will click on assistance, go up to create here, and you give it a name, you give it some instructions. You can see that this is the instructions that I've got here. So you can see with inside this particular copy here, I'm being pretty strict, I think, in the actual rule. Now, of course, if you're creating all different numbers of assistants, then you're going to give obviously this different instructions. But you can see here that I'm pretty well much saying that I want my IT support technician to obviously answer IT problems, but certainly refuse to answer anything outside of the context of an IT question. Now, of course, one thing in my experimentation of this is that you want to make sure that you adjust this if you're not getting quite the results that you need. You might need to be a little bit more relaxed, or you might need to be a little bit stronger in the instructions that you put in there. Because you might find you can actually ask something specific that might be not quite IT related, but still relate to the context of the conversation, that it might actually then refuse to actually answer it. So certainly just tinker with it a little bit with inside your use case, and you should be absolutely fine. So this is the assistant ID that's really important. This is the next piece that needs to be added into the AppState variable with inside FlutterFlow. So just make sure that you take a reference to this on a clipboard somewhere, and we'll come back and use that very, very shortly. So one thing you've also got in this platform is you've actually got a playground itself, so you can actually test this thing out within here. You can just kind of make sure you've got all of these details selected here. We're using the ChatGPT 3.5 turbo model. Of course, feel free, you can choose any of these other models that you might be then more comfortable with, or you might be getting different results with. So certainly try those out. Just please do bear in mind that, of course, using different models will obviously cost more with inside the platform. So just be fully aware of those type of costs that are associated with the use of these models. But I'm just going to use the Turbo 1106 model in this particular example. I'm not going to worry about any of this here. I'm just going to type a message in here and say my PC is getting overheated. Okay, let's just hit the send option, add to the run. And what's good here, I've got the logs being displayed here. You can kind of see some of the API calls that's actually getting kind of made. And you can see here that I've got a response back from the IT support technician. And now, of course, I can carry on having that conversation within here. And I can just test it out, just make sure that I'm getting the right results that I need for my application. So again, well worth having a look at the playground before you actually get into the FlutterFlow and actually start creating your application. So we'll leave it there. That's pretty well much all we need. Make sure you've got your API key and you've got your assistant ID that it's actually you've got on with inside the actual assistance itself, this one here. And let's now move over to FlutterFlow and let's now start building out this application. So just by way then of configuration, before we actually start talking more specifically about the APIs, I've lifted the API key and the assistant ID, and I've gone over to my AppState variables with inside my cloned project, and I've just put them in there. So we should be good to go now with everything set there. Let's now go and talk about the APIs. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how our FlutterFlow application will invoke all of these API calls. How are we going to go from nothing to then a message coming back from the OpenAI platform? So the first thing that we are going to do inside our application is we're going to create a thread. Now, I'm going to do this on the actual page load of our application, but of course, if you were probably building this out into a more substantial application, then probably what you would do is you would probably create a thread actually when the user is actually going to invoke a brand new conversation. Okay, so I'm only going to be having one conversation with inside our FlutterFlow applications. I'm going to create a thread when the actual page loads itself. Once we've actually created that thread, so that's going to be an API call out to the OpenAI platform. We're going to get a thread ID back. We're going to store that within inside our page state variable. You probably saw that earlier on, and we're going to keep a track of it because we're going to need to pass that in with further API calls. So once we've done that, we're then going to create our user message. Okay, so the user is going to type in the FlutterFlow text box at the bottom there. They're going to hit the send option. We are then going to put that message into the chat history because we don't need to kind of sort of get a return back from the OpenAI platform because you've got the message at that particular point. So I'm just going to display that on the UI. And then what I'm going to do is I'm then going to put that message actually onto the thread itself. So I'm going to be making a further API call out and putting that message onto the thread. Once that is done, I'm going to then instantly make a call out to the OpenAI platform and say, right, now go and run the assistant. So the assistant is going to run. And then what we then need to do is we then need to periodically check to see if the actual assistant has actually completed. So it will go into kind of this state where it's kind of in progress. And then, of course, it will then get to a status of completed. And once it is completed, of course, we can then put that message, that last message that's been returned is then going to be put into the chat history, which, of course, within inside our FlutterFlow application will be positioned underneath the message that we put in. And of course, we'll go along, we'll type another message in and we'll go back through this process again and again and again. So hopefully that is going to be pretty clear. If it's not, don't worry. We'll work through this stage by stage within inside the actual FlutterFlow application. So when we start sort of putting the API calls together and the action blocks together. So let's now move on. Okay, so back with inside our FlutterFlow project, I've moved over to the API call section and let's now start creating our API. So the first thing that we need to do is create an API group. So just go to create API and we're going to give our API group a name. So OpenAI Chat GPT is the name I'm going to give. You can put that whatever you like in there. Let's put the API URL in. So that's really, really important. And we now need to start adding some headers into this particular setup. So we need to pass two headers in. So the first one we're going to pass it in is the actual API key itself. So this is what we need to type. So we've got authorization, a colon, a bearer, and then our token. We'll create that very, very shortly. Add the header in. We now need to put in. So that's the particular header that we need to put in there, the OpenAI-Beta Assistance V1. So please do check the documentation because it depends when you're actually watching this particular video. It could be that this is actually then out of beta and then you don't actually need to actually put this in there. But for now, I'm just going to put that in here because that's what is required at this particular time of recording. So we now need to go over to our group variable. Let's add a variable. Let's just call this one a token here because we reference it just up here in these square brackets. And we need to say this is a string, and that's all that we're going to need to do. So we're going to pass this actually into the actual every single API call that we make. We're going to pass that in here. So we can add the group. That's all done. And you can see here that it's created up here. Now, once we've actually got that, of course, we now need to create those individual API calls. Now, going back to what we just had in the previous section where we talked about the different API calls, we're now going to focus our attention on the thread. Okay, so this API call out to the thread. So choose add API call. So let's give our API call a name. So I'm just going to type in threads here, and I'm just going to do the same thing here because that's the endpoint URL that we actually need. Now this is going to be a post request. Now we're not actually going to pass anything into this, but actually if you look at the actual documentation for the Assistance API, you can actually pass in a message at the point that you actually create the thread. Now we're not doing that with inside our application. We're going to create the thread, we're going to get a reference back, and then we're going to add our message in at a later point. So just bear that one in mind if that's a scenario that you would wish to kind of use inside your own application. So we also just need to do one other thing as well is, so this is going to return back an ID for us. I'm just going to go into the JSON path and I'm going to add a JSON path and I'm just going to do ID here and I'm just going to pull in a name of the thread ID. D like that. So what this will just allow us to do within inside our inside the actual application itself, but actually this will give us a reference to the response that comes back. So if you look at the documentation for this particular API call, the result that comes back, you'll see that it's going to return back something called an ID, and this is really just a way for us to be able to pull that ID out of the JSON response, and it's going to be then referenced by the name thread ID, and you'll see how that's used in just a moment when we actually start using this particular API call. So that's all that we need to do. Just hit the add call. So I think we are good to go. So let's now move back over to the actual application itself, and let's now start setting up the invocation of this particular API. Okay, so here we are with the support assistant page. Make sure that you've got support assistance therefore selected. Let's move over to the actual actions itself. Click on the action flow editor, and you can see that I've also got one action block in here to start off with. And really all this is doing is just setting the dark mode, is just enforcing it. If you want to run this application in light mode, then just delete this out. And of course, when you run it up, then it will be in the light mode. So we're going to hit a little plus here. Just choose that, choose add action. And we're going to make that backend call now. So just go down to the backend database, choose API call, and I'm going to click on the group name here and choose the OpenAI ChatGPT. And of course, the endpoint that's been selected, it's the only one that's there at this moment, is called threads. We want to then add in these variables here. So just set additional variable. And of course, I need to pass in the token. So this is going to pull this out of the application state. So choose AppState, choose the API key, and that's all that we need to do. Let's just give this one a, let's just say API threads result. Let's just delete that there. So we've got a very clear name there. And of course, this is where we are at this particular stage. Now, what we're going to do is we need to get that ID that comes back. We need to store this within inside our page state variable. So that's really super simple. Just hit the little plus here, choose add action. Let's go up and type in state here and say update page state here. Go to add field, and we want to set the thread ID. So just choose thread ID because we've already got these set up as page state variables. We want to select the update, and we're going to say set value. So we're going to choose the selector here. We're going to go to the actual action output this here. So this is the API response. You can see here we've got the API thread result here. Just choose that. On the JSON response options, choose JSON body. And then here we now want to go to the JSON path. And if you recall, we just set that kind of that thread ID up with inside the settings where we had the $.id and we called it thread ID. So that allows us just to reference it here. And that's all that we need to do. And that value then will be stored for us to now use at a future time. So just hit confirm and we are good to go. Okay, so just to summarize then, so when our application actually fires up and the actual page loads, it's going to make that API call out, and then of course is then going to persist that thread ID within inside our page state variable for us to then use as we start now sort of building out the actual submit here to actually start doing the real meat of the application. Okay, so it's now time to create our second API call, which is then going to take the message that the user keys in here and drops it actually onto the thread itself. And of course, I'm going to apply that message actually within inside the kind of the history here, the chat history, almost instantly. And then of course, I will then make that API call. So let's now move back over to the API call section here. Let's just expand that out. Let's now create a brand new API call. Let's call this one message like that. Now this is going to be a post, of course, because we're going to be getting some content here. And we just need to now just sort of flash out the endpoint here, what we're actually going to be calling. So it's got / in there. So it's going to be threads, and then we're going to do /. We need to do an actual square bracket there, and we then need to do a thread ID, and then just to close the square bracket off, do /, and here it's just going to be messages, just like that. Now we'll create the thread ID variable in just a moment. In fact, we'll go and do that now. Let's go to variables here. Let's say add variable. Let's type in thread ID, and this is going to be passed in as a string. I'm going to say add variable again because this is going to be the most important bit now. Of course, we need to actually put some content. This is the actual content that the user has actually typed in. We also need to capture that here at this point. So we need to pass that actually into this particular API request. So we're going to type in content. It's going to be a string. And of course, we now need to go over to the body itself. We now need to actually kind of shape up the message that's actually going to be passed in to this particular API request. So let's just choose JSON. Now we've got some of these variables here, so we can drag those in just a moment. Let's just go in between here like that. Now I'm going to type in role here, and I'm going to do a colon, and I'm going to do another double set of quotes here. And this is going to be a user. Okay, just do comma, and we're going to do, this is where we're going to now put the content in. Just do a colon, just do another double quotes there, and we now need to just pass this actually into and just between the two quotes. That's all that we need to do. So that's done. You can see it's automatically formatted, so it's pretty valid for us. So that's pretty well much everything set up. We can just hit the add call. So that's that API call made. So let's now go back into the actual application itself, and let's now start setting this up with inside the Action Flow editor. So back within our page then, let's go to the Action Flow editor here. Let's actually just hit on the submit icon button. Let's go to the Action Flow editor, hit open, and we've now got this brand new flow. So let's hit the add action. So the first thing that we're going to do is make that API call. So just choose, just do a search API and choose API call here. Choose the group name. We know it's the ChatGPT one. We're just going to change the endpoint now to message, and we now need to just configure these particular values that we need to pass in to hit the little plus here. So the first one we're going to select is the thread ID. Now, of course, this was previously retrieved and stored inside the page state. So just choose that, choose thread ID, and then we need to set the additional variable. Just select this one here, choose the token, go to the value. Now, of course, the token is inside our AppState variable. So just go to and choose the API key there. And let's just say one more variable here. This is going to be the actual content itself. So just choose content, and we need to pull the content out actually from the actual text box itself, okay, that's been keyed in. So choose widget state here and choose the question test field here. So just select that one, and that is all that we need to do. So let's just change this here, API, because I always like to give these a name, API message result, and then that's then represented here. So of course the API call is going to be made. We're going to just assume that it's successful at this particular point, and we now need to move in this particular direction here because we're going to get a successful result back from the backend API call. So I told a little fib earlier on actually, because I've realized actually what I'm actually doing is I am actually getting the response back. Once we actually put the message actually onto the thread, I'm going to get a response back from that API request, which will be my message itself. And then I'm going to add that actually into the chat history, which will then be displayed with inside the FlutterFlow application. So what we need to do there is, and the way we need to actually add it into the chat history is we just need to hit the little plus here, choose add action. We need to go to the actual page state here. So let's just update the actual page state. We need to set the field, and this is where we now need to set, or we need at least add this value actually into the chat history. So just select that, go to the select update type, choose add to list, and then this is where we now need to pull out the part of the message that we got coming back from the OpenAI platform and actually add it into the list. So the way that we do that, we go to action outputs. We're going to go and choose the API message result here. So the response that comes back, just select that, choose the API response options, choose JSON body, and the available option, we just need to do a JSON path here, just select that. And now we need to navigate our way down actually into the response back from the message. So if you actually go and have a look at the API documentation, it gives you some examples there of the response that comes back on this particular API call. So this is going to be a content, okay, and you'll see that in that particular example. We're going to grab the very first one because it's going to be an array. So it's going to be obviously it could have multiple items in there, but we just want to pick out the first one, which is actually our message itself. We're then going to say to the data type, and we're going to choose the data type that we created earlier, which is content. Just select that, and of course our chat history is accepting a type content here as well. So these two are matching up quite nicely. Just hit confirm. So of course, what happens then, once the actual message has actually been added into the UI, we're going to want to clear the text from the actual field below. So just hit the little plus here, choose add action, type in clear here, and you've got clear text fields. Just choose that, and we just want to just select the little question test field there. So let's move up here, just hit a little plus here. The next step that we need to actually do is we then want to actually create a delay with inside the UI itself. So we just want to give the UI a little bit of time to catch up. So let's just choose the wait delay here. So I'm just going to choose a 500 milliseconds, just like that. So this is going to allow us to then have the message that we just keyed in added to the list, and then there'll be a very small delay, and then we can actually then scroll the actual the actual list, the actual point in the actual list view to the actual bottom. So actually it's actually a scrollable column actually, so it's going to move it to the bottom, so we get that effect that everything just keeps moving up the actual screen. So just choose plus here, choose add action, type it in scroll to, just select that. And of course, we're going to want to choose the scrolling chat column here because that's one that we've got here. And we're going to then scroll to the end and we can keep this as 500 milliseconds. That's fine. Okay, so next up, what we're going to do is we're actually going to create then the next API call, which will actually then run the assistant, if you remember back to the actual flow diagram that we had. So we now need to go over and we now need to create that API call. Okay, so here we are back with inside the API section. Let's expand the API group. Just select that. Choose Add API Call. We're going to give this a name. We're going to type in Run here. Now, this method type is going to be a post request, and we just need to now just pad out this URL. So it's going to be threads like that, / an open square bracket like that. Type in thread and then ID, which is with an uppercase I there. Just then close that off there and then do / and type in runs. And then we need to now create some variables. We need 2 for this particular API call. The first one that we're going to do is the one that we just got above. It's just going to be a thread ID like that with an uppercase I, as I did before. Type in string there. So that's these 2 are now going to match up here. And now we need to add the next one in. And this one is going to be a assistant ID like that, and we're just going to type that as or select that as a string there. That's all that we need to do. Now we now need to create the body. This is what's going to now be passed over into the API with the actual request is going to be the body. So just choose a JSON body here, and we now just need to work on this here. So just move that there. Now just do a double quotes assistant like that with an underscore and then ID just like that. Do a colon there and then just do some 2 double quotes, and then we're just going to drag the assistant ID in there. So we're going to pass in our assistant ID that we pass into this API call. That is all that we need to do. We are good with this particular API call. Let's just hit the add. And now that we've done that, we can now move over now and start invoking this particular API call. So let's go and do that now. Okay, back within our page then, let's hit the submit button. Let's move over to the action flow editor. Let's just move ourselves into a good place. Right, so now after the scroll to, let's now add that API call in. Hit the little plus here, add action, type in API, click on API call here, go to the group name as always, and then on here, we want to select run here. Now we want to pass in some variables here, so let's go and quickly do that. Let's choose the first, which is the thread ID. Now, as we know, that is located within inside the actual page state itself, so choose that. Set the next one, let's do the assistant ID. Let's go to the value here. Now this one, of course, is in the app state, so choose the assistant ID. And then down on this one, this is going to be obviously our token. And of course, that is also within inside our app state. So just choose the API key. Let's just make a change here. Let's just do run assistant result here, just to give it a good meaningful name. And let's now move up here. Okay, one thing I forgot to do with inside the actual the configuration of the API is to actually set a value in there for the run ID. So let's quickly go and do that. Let's just close out of this, go back to the API calls, open up this particular section here, click on the run here, go to the response and test, and I need to add a JSON path in here. Now the JSON response we're going to get back from our API request is going to be again an ID that's going to come back, and in here we just need to type in run ID just with an uppercase I, so we can now reference that back with inside the action flow editor. Just hit save. Let's move back over to the widget tree here. Let's go to the actions. Let's open that back up again. Let's go right back to where we were, and we need to set the page state variable. So choose the add action. We now need to persist the run ID that's come back from this API call. So let's just do a search for page state here. Just click on the update page state, set the add field, choose the run ID here that we've got, and we're going to set this value to be then that value that's come back from our action output. So just choose this one here. Just scroll down and you can see why it's now important. Of course, if you've got a really complex kind of number of action blocks within inside the action flow editor, this is why it's really important sometimes to give your API responses some meaningful names, because I know that I've just created one called API Run Assistant, and I can see it here without it being a bit more sort of random sort of text here to kind of make them unique. So that makes it just really easy for us to select that one. Within inside the API response, just choose JSON body here, select the available options, just say to JSON path, just scroll down here, and we're now going to select that name here, a run ID, and then there's no further changes that's needed. Just hit confirm. Okay, so now we're going to get to a really interesting bit now with inside this particular action flow where we're now going to implement a loop. Now the loop's going to be really important to us because we're going to need to make that check. Just as I was sort of discussing during the actual API flows, you know we need to go into this loop now. We need to check to see if the assistant has actually completed its task. And if it has completed its task, we can then carry on and then we can go and get the messages then from the actual API and then display them, of course, on the UI. So this is now where we need to now add a loop in. So just with inside this page state here, just hit the plus here, choose the add loop option here. And then the loop that we need to have here is we're going to say, well, I keep looping round until the actual status of the API result is actually set as completed. So what we need to do is we need to go to conditions here, choose a single condition, choose the first value, and then click on here. Now it's going to be the page state variable that we actually had here. So choose page state, and you can see here we've got this one called status, and we're going to say it's not equal to completed. So of course, when it comes into this loop, then it's not going to have any value at all. It's not going to be completed whatsoever. So we're going to do the loop, and then when we've actually got that positive result from the API, we know that it's completed. We'll actually set the page state variable to be completed, and of course the loop will then break. So let's now choose the value here to be completed. We're just going to type that in there just like that. So if it's not equal, if the status is not equal to completed, then the loop will just go round in a basically a loop, right? Okay, so now we've done that, we can now start working on our next bit here. Now the next bit, what we now need to do is we now need to invoke this actual API. Okay, so we now need to go and create another API. So let's go and do that now. Okay, so let's move over to the API section here. Let's open up this one now. Let's add a brand new API call in. We're just going to call this one retrieve run like that. Now, this is actually going to be a GET request, and we now need to fill out the endpoint here. So this one is threads, and then we just need to do the square bracket, open square bracket, and type in thread, and then uppercase ID, just like then the closing square bracket, do /. We're going to type in runs here, /, and then of course now we will need to pass in our run ID that we retrieved previously when we executed the actual system. So now we need to create some variables for these. So as we did previously, type in thread ID like that, go to type, it's a string, add the next one in, run ID with uppercase I, type in the string there, and that's all that we need to do. What we also need to do here though is we need to actually now pick up the status that actually comes back. So we're gonna fire this off, we're gonna pass in those particular variables, we're then gonna get a status back, and that status we need to capture here. So just choose this here, and then we're just going to do a status like this, and in the name we're going to type in, if I just select that, so we're going to type in status like that. Very, very simple. So we've now got our reference now into the status of the response that comes back. Choose add call like that, and we are set up. So now let's move back over to the widget tree. Let's go back over to the action flow editor. So back within the action flow editor of our button, let's select the actual action we got here. Let's type in API. Let's go to the API call. Let's choose the group name here as always. Just change from threads down to retrieve run, and then we now need to set our variables. So just as we did before, let's set the thread ID. Of course, that's in the page state. Choose thread ID, choose the next one here, choose the run ID. Again, this is in the page state. Let's grab that there, and then let's just move on and add in the token as well, which of course is in the app state, and that is the API key. So they're all set up, which is great. So let's now just give this a decent name. Retrieve run result, just like that. There we go. Let's just move this up and give us a bit more space. Okay, so on a success, of course, we now need to set a page state variable. Now, this is going to hold the actual status that comes back from the API. So let's just type in state here, and let's go to, in fact, let me just spell it right, state, there it is. Let's go to update page state, choose the field. We're going to choose the status here, just select that, select the status, the set value, and then we obviously need to set this now to the actual output of the retrieve run result. So just select that. We're going to choose the API response as JSON body, and then we're going to select the JSON path. Now, obviously here we just want to choose the status option that we set earlier. Just hit confirm. So that's all now set. Now what we now need to do, we now need to check to see the actual condition to see if it's not equal to be completed. Okay, so let's choose the little plus here. Let's choose add conditional. So this condition is going to be a not equal to, okay, so we're just going to choose the first value here, just choose that here, and we want to go to the page state. Let's grab the status, and we're going to say is not equal to, and then set the value to be completed, just like that. Hit confirm. So we're going to move into this particular direction here, and what we're going to need to do in this particular situation is we're going to want to wait 3 seconds, and I'm just going to set it as 3 seconds here, and then of course it's then going to go back round again. It's going to do the API call, and as soon as it's completed, it'll obviously then break out the actual loop. So just choose the little plus here, choose add action, type in here wait, just select that, and we're going to set this as 3000, which is going to be 3 seconds. Of course, you can increase this a little bit longer if you want to. If you want to kind of maybe save multiple API calls from being carried out, but we're just going to set it at 3 seconds. I think that's quite acceptable with inside this particular application. Okay, so now that our loop is kind of all created, there's nothing further we actually need to do inside this particular loop. We now need to now handle the situation that once the loop is completed, so once that status has been marked as completed, we then need to then carry on. And then the next step that what we need to do is we then actually need to go and retrieve the messages to then display with inside the UI. Now we're only going to retrieve one message back, the very last one that gets created, and then we're going to then display that with inside the UI. So let's now go over and let's create the API call to do that. Okay, so you'd be pleased to know this is the final API call that we need to create. So let's now create that. Now let's add the API call. Type in messages here as the name. This is going to be a GET request, and we need to add in some endpoint information here. So this is going to be threads as we did before. Let's just do a /. Let's do a square bracket, and let's do thread ID as well. So let's do that / messages on the end. Now we need to add in a query parameter here, because what we're going to do is we only want to bring back one single message, the very, very latest message that gets created. So let's just type in a limit here, a specific value. Let's go to the type. It's going to be integer, and we're just going to put a 1 here to represent a single message to come back. We now need to create some variables as we did before. So we need to do the thread ID here. So just select that, type the string in there. That is good. And we need to go over to the response and test, because this is quite important now, because what we now need to do is when we get that response coming back of all the messages, we now really need to drill down into the response and actually pull out that single message. So the way that we do that is we say add a JSON path here. Now we know we're going to get a response back from data, so we now need to do a square open bracket here, do a 0, which is going to be the very first one in the actual list, do a period as a full stop, and do content, and then do another open square bracket 0, and then just shut that down then with a closing square bracket. So that's going to really drill down, and I can show you that with inside the API reference, because here we've got the data that comes back. So what we're doing is we're sort of moving ourselves all the way down in this response, moving down with inside the content. Here is the array here. We just want to pull out this single message that comes back. So that's what that is exactly doing with inside this JSON path. It's just drilling right down, and we just now need to give a name here as well, and it's just going to be data. So that's all that we need to do. I think that's all set up for us. Yes, let's now add the call, and we can now move back over to the action flow editor, and we can do the final pieces of these action blocks to get this up and running. Okay then, so back in our action flow editor, let's add that API call, add the action, type in API, choose API call, select the group as we always do, and then set the, go to the endpoint name, of course, select messages here, and then go to the variables. And of course, we now need to just fill these in as we did before. You should know by now that this one is in the page state. And of course, we now need to set the API key, which is our token. So go to the app state and choose the API key. So they're all set. Now let's give everything a name here. Just collapse those up. Let's now call this one API get message result. That is good. So let's now move that up here. And of course, we're now going to move into this particular direction. So we now need to grab that single message that we got returned, and we need to add this now to our chat history. So then it gets displayed with inside the UI. So just choose the little plus here, go to add action. Let's type in state here, say update page state, choose the set fields, and we're going to choose our chat history. Just select that there. Go to select update type. We need to add it to the list, so just select that. And of course, we now need to choose this value to add, and we need to go down to the action output, and of course, it's the API get message result. So go to the API response options here, choose the JSON body, of course, which is the responses come back. Go to the actual JSON path, and we're just going to choose a JSON path. This is the data that we just created in the API call. Just choose data, and we're going to want to convert this to the actual data type. So the data type in our instance is called content. So just choose content here, and that's all that we need to do. Hit confirm. So hopefully that should all work for us very shortly. So as we did previously, we need to wait for the UI to kind of sort of catch up. So let's just put a wait in here, put the delay in here. Let's just choose 500 then, that's half a second. So that's good. On the next one, we now then need to add an action. Of course, we've now got to scroll to the end now. So just choose the scroll to, and we're going to choose the scrollable widget, which is our scrolling chat column. So just choose that. And we're just going to say scroll to end. That is good. And so finally, just one more thing to do, just as a bit of a cleanup thing, we need to add another action in here, and we're just going to set the status, and we're going to set the value of the page state here. So type in page update page state here, choose set fields, choose the status here, and the update type is going to be a reset value, and that is all that we need to do. So hopefully, fingers crossed, and we'll be able to fire this up very, very shortly and see if we've made any mistakes. There, no doubt, there might be something that we've done wrong along the way, but that's all to do with live building, and we'll see how we can sort of fix it together. So I think that is good. Let's just close that down, and I think we are now in a position where we perhaps, although not quite actually, there's one thing that we need to do which is super important, is we need to actually bind these particular values here to the responses come back with inside the messages. So let's do that now. So let's now choose the first one here. Let's go up to the text selector here. Let's choose chat item. So this, of course, is in our list view itself. So just select that. We're going to say data structure field. We're going to choose the select field, which is going to be the text. The available option is going to be the data structure field again. And of course, inside that, we have the value. This is the text that's contained within inside. Okay, that's all that we need to do. Hit confirm. I'm just going to select it again, and I'm going to go up to the little three dots here. Let's copy that variable, because I'm going to move it over to this one here. Use the selector, move the paste there, because it's going to do exactly the same thing on that particular side. So we are good. Hopefully, let's now spin this up and let's see if it works. Okay, so let's see if the application springs into life. Come on now, it's thinking about it. Excellent, there it goes. That's a good start. It's fired up. So let's now ask it a question. My computer keeps making a weird noise. Hit the send option. Okay, so my my message has gone into the chat history at the first start. That's great. Okay, sounds like you may have hardware issues. So we've now got a response back from the OpenAI platform. Can you guide me through some options? Hit the send. Hopefully I'll get a more accurate response now. There we go. Okay, so that's looking good. So it looks like we've got the IT kind of element is kind of working really good for us. Let's do the bake cake example. Let's try and see if it actually stops from giving me suggestions about how to bake a cake. How can I bake a cake? Put a question mark there. Hopefully it should give me a response back to say that it only handles IT related problems. There we go, which is exactly the response that we're looking for. So things are looking super good, and our example is up and running. And hopefully, if you've been following along, this is working for you too. So I just want to point out in this particular video that this is obviously a simple example, and we're using OpenAI directly from within inside the FlutterFlow application. Now, if you're taking these type of steps in your own applications, then you need to think long and hard about any potential security risks. And there is a security risk by doing this, because what you're actually doing is you are embedding your API key within inside the AppState. That's your OpenAI API key. And of course, there is a risk that you're application could then get compromised. Somebody could then take your API key and then they could then start carrying out all of those requests to the OpenAI platform. Now that's not ideal. Now, of course, if you are building a web application, it's really, really easy for anybody to interpret the actual request is being made to the OpenAI platform, and then they can then start carrying out those activities, which is not ideal. So one thing that I would suggest that you consider if you are looking at doing this in a more serious way for your own application is that I would look to actually move the communication that your application does with the OpenAI platform into some back-end solution. So for example, there's plenty out there that you can use, such as Buildship, FastGen, there's Xano, a number of different services are out there that you can actually use, where you actually would put all of those out into those services, and then all your FlutterFlow application is then doing is calling out to those back-end services, which will then in turn call out to the OpenAI platform. Now the beauty of that is that your API key can be stored securely within inside those back-end services. Okay, so you're not exposing that via your application. So what you'll see on YouTube and other sort of sites and training sites is that there'll be plenty of examples where they're using FlutterFlow to call out to those services, but in best practice, that is not the best thing to do. So for example, I'll show you what this might look like in, say, Buildship, for example, which I'll show you on my screen now. Okay, so here we are then in Buildship, and you can see what I'll do is I'll also create a video where we can actually create this AI assistant application actually using a service such as Buildship. And you can see here that what I've got some workflows on the left hand side, which are really just carrying out those activities that we've got. So you can see here that we're kind of creating the threads, we're adding the message, we're then running the assistant, we're then checking the actual run, and then we're getting the messages back. And really these are very, very simple kind of Buildship nodes that's being created that just really very much do what is actually happening with inside FlutterFlow. And of course, what I've got here is my actual OpenAI key is stored securely within inside the Buildship platform. So that's great. That means that nobody can kind of grab hold of that OpenAI key, and I've got full control of anybody who's actually interfacing with the OpenAI platform. So I will do a proper video on this. I'll walk you through the steps required to convert the IT support assistant to actually use a service such as Buildship, but I'll walk through that on another video, so do look out for that one, and I'll do that very, very soon. Okay, so that's a wrap for this particular video. Hopefully you have enjoyed it. Please do check the link in the description, of course, because that's got the actual final project, which I've kind of done a little bit of additional work in there as well. I've actually kind of commented all of the actions and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully you should be able to align with what's going on there, just if you're getting stuck. And of course, as well, I also try to make the samples a little bit more meaningful by sort of renaming all the widgets, all that kind of stuff, to have a little bit of a better quality to the actual sample project. Please do keep subscribed to the channel, and of course please do like the video as well, because that obviously gets out to the FlutterFlow community, of course, and I'll be covering a lot more about AI as well on my channel. So if that's a topic that you love and you're interested in, then please do stick as a subscriber. So until the next video, I'll see you soon.